What if an entire civilization chose to leave behind only faces and nothing else to explain who they were? Don't scroll. Stay with me, because these silent stone heads are the last witnesses of a people erased by time. Keep watching. Scattered across isolated landscapes, massive stone heads stare outward with expressions that feel intentional, almost watchful, as if guarding secrets they were never meant to share. No grand palaces remain clearly intact. No written records explain their names, beliefs, or stories, and yet these faces survive, carved from stone so heavy that even moving them today is a challenge. The choice to create such monumental portraits suggests a culture deeply invested in identity, memory, and presence. These were not random decorations. They were statements in stone, meant to endure long after voices faded. The labor required to carve and transport giant stone heads hints an organized society with specialized skills, leadership, and shared purpose. Stone of that scale does not move itself. It demands coordination tools and knowledge of materials. The people who created these monuments likely had rituals, beliefs, and social structures that made such massive efforts meaningful. The faces themselves vary in detail, suggesting individuality rather than generic symbolism. This raises a possibility that each head represents a specific person, perhaps leaders, ancestors, or figures believed to hold power beyond death. If so, these monuments were not just art, but anchors of memory meant to hold identity in a world where everything else could be lost. The environment where these heads stand today often feels empty and remote, adding to the sense that a thriving culture once existed where silence now reigns. Over time, houses, tools, and everyday objects decay quickly, especially in harsh climates. Wood rots, fibers dissolve, and metals corrode. Stone, however, resists time. If this culture built primarily with materials that do not last, the stone heads may be the only survivors of a much richer world. What we see today could be the tip of an iceberg, the last durable trace of a civilization whose daily life, language, and traditions have vanished without a record. This selective survival distorts our understanding of the past, making cultures seem simpler than they were, when in reality their complexity simply did not endure in material form. There's also the unsettling possibility that parts of this culture's story were lost not only to time, but to disruption. Migrations, conflict, environmental change, and disease can fracture societies and erase memory within generations. When communities collapse or scatter, the knowledge of why monuments were built can disappear even if the monuments remain. The stone had become symbols without context, their original meaning stripped away. What once might have been a living tradition becomes a mystery to outsiders and descendants alike. This gap between creation and understanding reminds us that history is fragile when it is not written down or continuously practiced. If these silent faces staring across empty land made you feel like you were being watched by history itself, keep watching, follow for more lost civilizations, and stay curious, because sometimes the only witnesses left behind are made of stone. What if these giant stone heads were not meant to be admired, but meant to be watched by something beyond human eyes? Don't scroll. Stay with me, because this layer of the mystery changes how we see these monuments. Keep watching. Their placement often feels deliberate, positioned on high ground near coastlines or facing outward across open land, as if marking territory or sending a message into the distance. This careful positioning suggests they were not random sculptures, but part of a larger design that once shaped how people moved through and understood their world. Monuments that face outward invite interpretation, were they guardians, warnings, or symbols meant to project power beyond the borders of their homeland. The expressions carved into these massive faces vary in subtle but meaningful ways. Some appear calm, others stern, others distant, as if reflecting different roles or identities. This individuality challenges the idea that they were purely symbolic. If each face represents a specific person, then these heads could be a form of stone memory, preserving the presence of leaders or ancestors long after their bodies were gone. In societies without writing, such monuments can function as living archives, holding history in form rather than words. Over generations, people may have gathered around these faces, telling stories of who they were and what they stood for, keeping identity alive through ritual and repetition. As the culture that built them faded, the rituals that gave meaning to these faces likely faded too. Without continuous tradition, monuments lose their voice. What once spoke loudly through ceremony and shared belief becomes silent stone to later observers. Outsiders see only form, not function. They measure size, guess age, and debate purpose. But the emotional and spiritual context that once surrounded these heads is gone. The stone endures, but the story fractures. If this idea of monuments outliving their meaning is hitting you, keep watching. Follow for more lost meanings and stay curious, because the past leaves behind shapes, not explanations. What if these giant stone heads were only one small piece of a much larger world that vanished almost completely? Don't scroll. Stay with me, because this part reveals how much a civilization can disappear while one symbol survives. Keep watching. Cultures are not just monuments. They are homes, tools, songs, languages, rituals, and everyday routines. Most of these leave fragile traces. When a society collapses or migrates, the things made of wood, fiber, clay, and simple metals decay quickly. Entire cities can dissolve into soil within centuries, leaving behind only what was carved into the hardest stone. This created a false picture of the past, where a single type of artifact dominates our view of a culture that was once rich and varied. The giant stone heads may feel like the defining features of this people only, because everything else they built has been erased by time. This selective survival distorts how we imagine ancient societies. When we see only monumental art, we assume cultures were obsessed with monuments. In reality, monuments are just what survives longest. Daily life leaves lighter footprints. Kitchens, markets, schools, workshops, and homes vanish, while stone faces remain to tell a partial story. The people who made these heads likely lived in complex social worlds filled with relationships, conflicts, humor, fear, and belief. None of that survives in stone. What survives is the echo of a choice to invest effort in something meant to last. The heads may represent a final attempt to fix identity in a world where everything else was already fragile. There is something haunting about how history preserves symbols but forgets lives. We stand before these stone faces and search for meaning, yet the voices that could answer us are gone. The silence forces us to confront how easily entire ways of life can disappear while leaving behind a single, powerful image. If this idea of civilizations being reduced to one surviving symbol feels unsettling, keep watching. Follow for more lost worlds, and stay curious, because what we see in ruins is only a shadow of what once was. What if the giant stone heads were not just monuments to the past, but tools that shape how the living organize their world? Don't scroll. Stay with me, because this part explores how these faces may have influenced daily life and power. Keep watching. In many ancient societies, monuments are not passive objects. They are active symbols that organize space, authority, and belief. If these heads represented leaders or revered ancestors, their presence could turn ordinary land into sacred ground. Communities may have arranged gatherings, rituals, and decision-making around them, treating the space near these faces as centers of social and spiritual gravity. The monuments would not just reflect power. They would help create and reinforce it, reminding people who held authority and why obedience mattered. Over time, such symbols can shape how people see themselves and their place in the world. Standing before a massive stone face carved to outlast generations can make individual lives feel small and collective identity feel larger. This emotional impact is not accidental. Monumental art often exists to create awe, to bind communities through shared reverence or fear. If these heads were part of a broader landscape of meaning, their placement and scale may have guided movement, ceremony, and even political decisions. The people who carved them were not only shaping stone, they were shaping social reality. When the culture that created these heads began to weaken or fragment, the power of these monuments once held would fade with it. Without shared belief, even the most imposing symbol becomes just an object. Rituals stop, gatherings end, and the emotional charge of the space drains away. The stone remains, but the social energy that once animated it disappears. If this transformation of powerful symbols into silent objects feels striking, keep watching. Follow for more lost meanings, and stay curious, because monuments outlive belief, but they cannot replace it. What if these giant stone heads are not the end of the story, but the last surviving witnesses of a world that once believed memory itself could be carved into stone? Don't scroll. Stay with me, because this final layer ties the silence of these faces to the way civilizations try to defeat forgetting. Keep watching. When a culture chooses to invest enormous effort into carving human faces at monumental scale, it reveals a deep anxiety about time. People know that stories fade, that names are forgotten, that rituals weaken when generations pass. Stone is chosen because it resists decay. These faces were meant to outlive voices, to remain when songs stop being sung and names stop being spoken. In carving faces instead of abstract symbols, the builders may have been trying to preserve individuality itself, to insist that specific people mattered enough to be remembered long after their society changed or disappeared. But memory preserved in stone is incomplete. A face can suggest presence, but it cannot carry context. We see eyes, mouths, and expressions, but we do not hear the language that once animated them. We do not know the jokes they laughed at, the fears they whispered about at night, or the decisions they argued over. The monuments survive, but the living texture of culture does not. This gap exposes the limits of material memory. No matter how durable the medium, it cannot replace living transmission. The culture that built these heads may have believed they were securing permanence, but what they secured was only a fragment of themselves. Their world collapsed into an image, powerful but incomplete. The disappearance of this culture also forces us to think about how memory dies. It does not vanish all at once. First, daily practices weaken. Then rituals lose meaning. Then stories stop being told. Finally, names lose their reference. By the time outsiders encounter the monuments, the internal world that gave the meaning has already dissolved. The stone heads become floating symbols, detached from their original social and spiritual networks. This detachment invites speculation, myth-making, and projection. We project our own questions onto these faces because the original questions they answered are gone. In this way, lost monuments become mirrors. They reflect our curiosity, our fear of forgetting, and our desire to believe that something of us will remain when our own worlds change. There's a quiet lesson here about how civilizations try to defeat time. We build monuments, write records, archive data, and create images to preserve ourselves. Yet preservation is not the same as continuity. A monument can survive while a culture disappears. Records can exist while meaning is lost. What truly carries a civilization forward is not stone or data alone, but the ongoing practice of memory through shared life. When that practice breaks, what remains is a shell. The giant stone heads are shells of memory, powerful in presence but hollow in explanation. They stand as reminders that endurance of material does not guarantee endurance of meaning. Looking at these faces today, isolated in landscapes that no longer echo the lives that once surrounded them, we are confronted with our own vulnerability to forgetting. We assume our cities, languages, and digital records will preserve us. But the stone heads remind us that survival of objects does not equal survival of understanding. Future generations may stand before the ruins of our world with the same questions we ask of these faces, wondering who we were, what we valued, and why we chose certain symbols to represent ourselves. The final message of these monuments may not be about the people who carved them, but about the limits of memory itself. If this realization about monuments, memory, and the fragile survival of meaning made you pause, keep watching, follow for more lost civilizations, and stay curious, because what we leave behind will never fully speak for us.